Today, speaking with us will be Gwen Bradshaw, a former evangelical who has recently journeyed out of faith, and she'll share very interesting experiences with us today. So please help us welcome Gwen.
Thank you. Again, as Karina said, I am Gwen Bradshaw, and we'll be talking today about some of the highlights of my story from faith to Freethought. One thing I do want to say as we get started, though, is that my story is actually quite a bit... Oh, there we go. Thank you. That's my darling husband there, who has been part of this journey.
And also tech support.
And my tech support, yes. Yeah. So this is based on, these are some highlights, and what I'd really like to do is not just tell you a story today, not just share with you some oh my goodness moments, but to really help you understand the type of faith thinking that I had, to help you when you're dealing with family or friends who are still in faith, to explain to you how clear that faith thinking was, how concise it was, but how ultimately controlling being in that particular faith experience was. I'd also like to share with you about that searching thinking. What was it that I was thinking about? What were the experiences that changed my mind? What was that doubt, that despair that I felt as everything I had known to be true seemed to be disappearing before me? And how desperate I was to find truth, to find something that I could stand firm on. And finally, I want to touch on what it's been like to have free thought thinking. How emancipating it has been, how exciting, how enlightening, and yet at the same time just a little bit terrifying, because I'm now responsible for the choices that I make. So starting off very early on, this is actually a picture of me from the 6th grade Christmas play, where I was dressed up as Mary. I've looked younger than I am for a long time, still do. But I was saved at the age of 4, and I remember very clearly praying with my mom on our bedspread. It was a Raggedy Ann and Andy little bedspread my mom had made for me, and every night she would do Bible stories with us. And those Bible stories would talk about Jesus, how much he loved us, and she used Child Evangelism Fellowship materials. And that one night she shared with me that Jesus loved me so very much that he had died so that I could go to heaven instead of going to a really bad place called hell. I remember clearly that I had no concept of the idea of sin, but I knew that what love was, and that when somebody loved you, you did what they asked you to. So I prayed and asked Jesus to be my Savior. I soon began to understand the idea of hell and conducted my first evangelism at the age of 5. I took my sister, who was 3 1/2 at the time, and the neighbor girl Janie, and we were at Janie's house, and I locked all 3 of us in the closet with my little Bible, and I told them that hell was a lot scarier than it was in this dark closet. And I scared them enough that they cried, and I told them I wouldn't let them out of the closet until they prayed this prayer. Both of them prayed the prayer and were subsequently released from the closet. Sadly, that is still how my sister considers her salvation story. She recounts that and remembers it. And I think that's one thing that I've really thought about a lot lately, is that while children are so young, and that's what Child Evangelism Fellowship, who I worked with for a while, really tries to focus on getting children at that age. And I'm becoming very convinced that it is a form of child abuse. It is really cruel to put such heavy ideas on children who really can't understand properly. My heroes were missionaries, especially Elizabeth and Jim Elliot. They were my superheroes. For those of you who may have remembered the news story, Jim and Elizabeth Elliot were part of a team of 8 missionaries that went to Ecuador to reach out to the Auca Indians. They were a head-hunting, cannibalistic tribe that no one had been able to have successful contact with. And the 4 men who went in were killed by the Auca Indians, but Elizabeth Elliot went back. She ended up living with the Auca Indians, bringing English to them, and ultimately setting up a church there. And she was my hero. I studied and read everything I could about Brazil. There was nothing I wanted more than to be an Elizabeth Elliot. We had daily Bible training. We had a book where we would learn our Bible verses. I still remember the A was for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. B was believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. C was confess with your mouth. Yes, it was so ingrained. It was part of what we did every night. I went to Camp Good News. That's a child evangelism fellowship group. And you would go for a week, and I sent my kids there. This is fairly new. My daughter and son are sitting over here. And my daughter, when I told her a year ago that I thought I was an atheist, responded by saying, now? Couldn't have figured it out when I was a kid. But at Camp Good News, I heard the story of Amy Carmichael. And Amy Carmichael was a little girl who wanted blue eyes. And she had brown eyes, and her family had blue eyes. And she wanted blue eyes, and she trusted that God would answer her prayer. So Amy Carmichael had prayed, and she got up the next morning believing she would look in the mirror and see blue eyes. But they were still brown. And she began to question whether or not God was listening to her. Did God answer her prayers? But her mother and her Sunday school teacher told her to just wait, that God's plan was always perfect. And when Amy Carmichael grew up, she was a missionary to India. And when she was in India, she rescued small children from the temple worship there, which was a horrible thing. And she was able to do this because by dyeing her skin with tea and having brown eyes, she could mingle with the people of India and not be spotted as a foreigner. So this story taught us that God's plan was always perfect. It was always right. It didn't matter if he said no to your prayer. It was because he had something better for you. I loved especially the Child Evangelism Fellowship clubs. I spent a summer as a summer missionary for them. I taught my own children with their materials. As a teenager, though, things happened in our family. My dad lost his job a few times due to different economic principles, sometimes due to his temper. And we ended up at a church in Massachusetts, and I started to really study. I was doing Bible quizzing. If you're not familiar with Bible quizzing, that's where you memorize entire books of the Bible, and then you go and you jump to answer questions and you get points. I was #1 in New England for a while. I made it to internationals where I placed 37th. At one point I could quote for you the book of James. I could quote for you Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
A little one.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a waste.
So that was also a time where I started having questions like, what about good conflicting prayers? We were living on a farm and there was a big evangelism meeting coming up, and I was going, we need rain for the farm. If we don't have rain, the cows aren't going to produce, the corn's not going to be good. We need rain. But there was also this big evangelism thing going on that Saturday, and everyone was praying for sun so that people could be saved. And I was like, how can God answer both those prayers? He can't. It's not possible to answer both of those. And I was told I was thinking too much. Then I started asking about Pharaoh and Judas. I went, God hardened Pharaoh's heart in that story. How could Pharaoh be held responsible for what God made him do? That's not right. And then Judas, I said, Judas was essential for the salvation story. If it hadn't been for Judas, none of us could get saved. How could Judas be held responsible for what he had done? And I got told the answer to that was that God already knew that they would do that. He just hardened their heart at that time in order to serve his purpose. So once again, God's answer was better than my answer. I also started to question why I was stuck with a childhood choice. I was beginning to realize that I was understanding Christian faith, and I was being told that because I'd accepted Jesus as a child, that I could not be left. I could not get away from it. My salvation was sure, and that if I tried to walk away from God, he would send the hounds of heaven to chase me back to salvation.
So like super hyper Calvinism?
Hyper Calvinism, absolutely. I began to wonder, is God really good? He hardens people's hearts. There's no way he can answer all prayers. I'm stuck with a childhood choice. And I'm like, how can I even know? So as a teenager, I started doing whatever I could that the church said no to. I figured that was the best way to find out. God said no to drugs. God said no to drinking. God said no to sex. I was going to go try all those things out and see if maybe they were good. Well, just because the church says something is bad doesn't mean it's good. And there were consequences. And those consequences caused me to really think about the fact that I had disobeyed God. Because my thinking was black and white. This was a black and white world. It was good or it was bad. It was God or it was Satan. And when I had these consequences, I interpreted that as being that I had disobeyed God, not that I had made bad choices. Nowhere in my thinking did I even entertain the idea that maybe there wasn't a God. That didn't even cross my mind. There are times I think back and I go, wow, if only I had even known that that was an option to pursue. But to me, it was either God or Satan. I was going to follow one of the two. Challenging God brought me pain. Of course, we know that the things I chose to do are unhealthy and unwise, especially at the tender age of 15. And so I decided I didn't like pain. My only option was going to be commitment to God. Full-scale, total commitment. And I was not going to question God again. I had learned my lesson. No more questioning God. I was going to be an Amy Carmichael and trust that my brown eyes were for a purpose. I went so far as to write out this commitment. This is called a certificate of ownership. I can't read it from there, so I'm going to turn just a little bit. And I wrote, as of July 22nd, 1986 AD, I, Gwendolyn D. Blodgett, my maiden name, do transfer all of my rights, possessions, talents, dreams, successes, education, failures, complaints, expectations, relationships, career, family, physical appearance, health, and any other aspect of my life to God the Almighty, the Creator, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, Savior, Redeemer, the great I am, the holiest of the holy. This statement means that I now belong totally, 101% to God, my loving Father, and any problem that heads my way is not mine, but God's, and any victory that is achieved in my life is not mine, but God's. This I put together at a life conference in Colorado. There were hundreds and hundreds of teens. They kept us up late. They had intense, yes, I see the horror on your face. No, it's all right. I hang on to this only as a reminder of just how all-consuming this thinking is and how damaging ultra-faith is. Now again, I do have some friends who have a much more liberal, open sort of faith, and for them, religion doesn't seem to inhibit their thinking. But for me, and the thinking and the relationships that I was in, everything revolved around God, and I had nothing left that was mine. I abdicated every choice, every thought to this God.
Excuse me, were you 13 or were you 19?
I was 17 at the time. Yeah, I was 17.
Thank you.
Yeah, oh, you're welcome. Please ask questions anytime. So that preceded committing myself as much as possible to God, and that included getting involved in being a gospel clown.
It's the obvious choice.
It's the obvious choice. So what I would do is I would paint my face, dress up as a clown, and go out and tell people they were going to hell. So
Just a slightly less
bit creepy.
of song.
Yes, just a little.
Did you give out balloons?
I did.
What did they say on them?
Well, we would hand out Child Evangelism Fellowship tracts with the animal balloons.
You didn't have "You're Going to Hell" balloons.
I did not have "You're Going to Hell" balloons, no. If I'd thought of it, I probably would have, but thankfully that idea was not there. Generally, one of the things we would do is we would go into either a park or a church, and there would be mass invitations to bring in families. And usually the skit that I would do, and Heather's smiling, she loves this story, is that I would hide on the stage, and after the lights came up for our Bible show, I would pop up with a bowl of cereal and have fallen asleep on the stage. And of course, you know, there's nothing scarier than seeing a clown pop up from the bottom of the stage. And then I would come back out after my mom would send me off, and then I'd come back out crying because I wanted to go to heaven and I didn't know how to go to heaven. And then my mom would say, well, I can tell you how to go to heaven. And I said, oh, great. So I'd run off and I'd grab this big suitcase and a can of hot air popcorn popper, and I'd start popping popcorn to take to heaven. And I'd bring my toothbrush, and I had my giant sunglasses, and each of these things had something about heaven. Like the sunglasses were because I didn't want to blind my eyes with the light of God and these type of things. And then my mom came out and said, no, you can't bring anything with you to heaven. You can't, and I started to cry again. And so then I said, well, I'm going to find a map to heaven. And I used flash paper. So I would read it. I couldn't read it. I'd use a lighter. And of course, the map would go up in flames. So again, I cried. And the best part was then I strapped a rocket to my back, and I climbed up to the highest part of the church. And I'd done drama in high school, so I knew how to do a pratfall. And my dad would light the back of the rocket. We had a balloon there. So as I jumped, the balloon would explode with a pop, and confetti would come flying out of the back of the rocket. I'd attempt to fly and roll down the stage, and people would laugh, and then we would tell them how they could really get to heaven by praying and asking Jesus. I wonder sometimes about those poor children who saw that. Because I'm not sure we were ever really clear about the whole idea that this was not something we were going to do tomorrow. And I wondered if some of the children might have been afraid that if they prayed this prayer, they'd be in heaven the next day. I did my gospel clowning. I also became a missionary. This is my first husband, and the cute little girl in the red dress is sitting right over there. That's you, yes, dear.
The small one.
Yeah. Because again, at this point, what we had done is we were just feeling that we weren't doing enough for God. We weren't doing enough, so we sold everything we owned, and we went and worked for this mission board, and we had to raise our own money. We actually were given a book called People Raising, which taught us how to talk to people in such a way that they would give us money so that we could be missionaries. And we lasted there about 1.5 years, and we were unable to raise all of our support. So once again, instead of questioning whether or not this was the right thing for us to be doing, this had to be part of God's ultimate plan. So even though there were some horrific things that happened and some challenging events that we really don't have time to go into today if we're going to get to everything, there was no questioning. It was just, this is what God is doing. If this is what he's done, this is what must be right. So we ended up becoming pastor and pastor's wife. So this was the first church, yes, I'm sorry. This was the first church that my ex-husband pastored. And here we thought maybe we were finally where God wanted us to be. We were going to win everyone to Christ here in this church. We did all sorts of outreaches. I was the person who came to your door and gave you a Jesus video. It was just everything we could do because we believed so strongly that this was the only right answer. And I really felt that if I didn't do this, that I was as guilty of some horrific act as if I let you be hit by a bus. I felt so strongly that hell was such a real possibility. And one of the reasons that I had felt that way is that as a teenager, when I was going through my anti-church phase, I was sent to a drug and alcohol rehab weekly group meeting. And in one of the meetings, this boy started asking questions about heaven and the purpose of life and meaning. And I sat there feeling the spirit. It was really just all of that brainwashing. But at the time, I thought it was God talking to me, telling me to tell him the answers. That I was supposed to speak up and tell him how to go to heaven. That I was supposed to just right then and there say, I've been wrong. I tried to walk away from God, and I refused. I did not want it. I did not want what God was pushing on me. And I know now that it was not anything supernatural. It was just the brainwashing.
But how do you know that?
How do I know that now? I'll get there.
And also, where was the church?
This was in Carthage, New York.
Oh.
Yeah. So the following week, I showed up at group. And that kid had died over the weekend. He had been out drinking on the cliffs. This was in Rhode Island. And he had fallen off the cliffs and died. And that was part of why I went back to faith. Because I believed that that boy was in hell and it was my fault. So I carried this burden of being responsible.
But if you're a hyper-Calvinist, you don't know if the Holy Spirit would have done something inside of him.
At that point, I had been in a church that was starting to teach us. It was weird because they taught us the hyper-Calvinism,
Yeah.
but they mixed in some Arminian views as well.
Yeah.
So you were saved if you were saved, but there was this like catch
Yeah.
where you were also responsible for someone else's salvation. So I knew that there was a possibility.
Because usually it's God's
Right.
using you to save someone, so you aren't really doing anything. It's
Right,
God's grace.
it was more of a three-point Calvinistic type
Okay.
of thing where I couldn't get out of my salvation, but
Yeah.
I was still responsible for other people's
Okay.
salvation.
I
Yeah.
just wanted.
Oh no, that's all right. That's all right. I don't always run into people who understand the finer points of Calvinism and Arminianism.
I don't think anyone understands the
That's true. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Calvinism and Arminianism are two different schools of thought that are highly combative with each other among your evangelical Christian faiths. And Arminians generally believe that you can lose your salvation, and Calvinists generally believe that you cannot lose your salvation. It goes a lot deeper, but that's probably the big difference between the two. One of the big differences. So I felt really burdened that I had to share. But at this time, our marriage was starting to really go downhill. It had never been incredibly great, and I kept believing that if I was just a better 1 Peter 1 wife, which taught that if a wife was good and loving, that she would win her husband to the right behavior without having to say a word. And so I kept my mouth shut most of the time. And I confessed and apologized whenever I didn't. It was a very man-centered family. And what I found is that in the area of Christianity that I was, narcissism is almost a natural part of it. For one thing, we taught that you could know what God wanted for you, that you were so important to God that He sent His Son, your prayers were being listened to, and in a sense, even though you don't realize it, you're creating a world that revolves around you. And in our family, the husband was the head of the home, as Christ is the head of the church. And I was to obey completely, because anything my husband asked me to do was coming from God. So to not obey my husband was to disobey God. And
I'm
yes.
sorry, within the church, was there like a hierarchy above your husband, like the church elders, or?
Unfortunately, in the church that we were in, he was the highest point.
Was there kind of a regional or national group that was?
It was Southern Baptist, and so there was a regional grouping, but there was no one who was over the church. They believed very strongly in the autonomy of the local church and the pastor being the head of that church. And so while there was an area missionary, his job was to come in alongside the pastor, to support the pastor, to help the church obey the pastor as well. I don't really want to get into a whole lot about the marriage and how it fell apart, but that particular formula was very bad for our family. And there was a lot of emotional abuse. There was even a lot of physical abuse in the sense that basic needs were not met. So there was not a lot of violence beyond the spankings that we believed God ordered us to give our children. We always did it according to what we had been taught was the right way to do it. I now would never spank a child. I wouldn't. Looking back, I wish I'd never had. And so do my children. But it was very centered around him. And I remember that I would gather the kids secretly for us to pray for him. So he would do something that was inappropriate towards the family. And our response was not to say, no, that's not okay to do in this home, but it was that we would go and secretly in a closet or in a bedroom and pray for him, because God was going to answer our prayers. And if I tried to do anything to correct my husband's behavior, I was stepping out of line from God's path, and that would prevent him from changing. The only way for my husband to change was for me to stay silent. And this is a very damaging environment. I recently was listening to a talk about this, and there's many women who have come from my particular brand of faith that have had narcissistic, abusive husbands. And one of the theories around that is that a man who isn't wanting to own a wife, who isn't wanting to be the supreme commander of a home, isn't going to be attracted to that kind of faith. I know my husband now is, the last thing he wants to do is be responsible for the choices I make. So anyways, as you've probably imagined, there was a divorce, and it was a very painful divorce. It was very hard for me to go through because it disqualified me and it disqualified him from serving in the church. No longer was I even able to work in the nursery. And so while I got to a point that I was able to see the abuse because it was starting to affect my children. If it had just been me, I think I would have continued in it, but I started seeing how it was affecting my kids and ended up going through the divorce, believing that this was how God was going to bring him back to him. And I really ended up with a lot of magical thinking through this, because now I had started twisting what I'd already believed into a way that I could fit what I was now experiencing. So up until that point, I had always been a never divorce, and now my thinking was twisting to enable me to get my children to a safe place, which brought in some really magical thinking. So one of the things that happened was that I decided to buy a Christian supply center, Christian bookstore. I felt that God was calling me to do something. I was disqualified from working in the church anymore, but I could own a Christian bookstore. So I bought a dime bookstore without the consultation of good legal people. I refused the help of the Small Business Administration because the woman attended a Unitarian Universalist church. And instead, I became part of a group called Bibles for Watertown, and we were working with an organization to put a Bible in every home in Watertown. And the person I was working with was a Pentecostal Puerto Rican portly pastor. And he knew that the store was struggling, and he came in and did an exorcism of the store for me so that I could have the spirits released so that God's blessing could flow through. They came through with a giant sword. They brought a gallon jug of oil, olive oil. They anointed the outside of the building with oil. I didn't tell you about
slip
this.
on that?
Yeah.
I just have a quick question. You described your background as Southern Baptist. Did you have any background? Because in evangelical, there's a big kind of fight between people, like recently, like Mark Driscoll and like John MacArthur, over Pentecostalism and that charismatic kind of stuff is very controversial among many hyper Calvinistic Orthodox types. Were you from a background that was okay with Pentecostalism, or is that something that was shocking to you?
No, the Pentecostalism was something new to me.
Okay.
And so the kind of magical thinking opened my eyes to this Pentecostal side, and I thought, well, let's give it a try. And it helped that I was dating the portly Puerto Rican Pentecostal pastor, much to my children's chagrin. They came through with the sword, speaking in tongues, slicing through the air, pointed out the merchandise that I had that was preventing God from blessing the store, and I threw the merchandise away so that God could bless the store. We ended up going bankrupt. Because again, you know, it's this magical thinking, this David against Goliath, God's going to be there. And he wasn't, you know, it wasn't there. The other thing was defeating the devil. We were going to defeat the devil in Watertown. So not only was I defeating him in the store, we would pray as we walked through the center of town. We believed that the devil lived in the library for the town, and that Watertown was one of the points of we believed that Watertown was one of the points of a pentagram on the map, that if you took a map and you took Watertown, Watertown was the upper point, Boston was the one over here, New York City. I don't remember the other 2 points of the pentagram. Yes. So we were, I really sunk into some real magical thinking. And reality began to disappear a little bit. Thankfully, the Portland Pentecostal pastor decided that because my divorce was not legitimate, he originally had thought it was legitimate and then decided it wasn't. He ended things with me. I ended up meeting Bill, and Bill helped me close down the store. I went through the bankruptcy, and I just struggled. Bill and I were going to be married in our church. We ran into a situation where I could either move my children and myself in with Bill a week before the wedding, or I could keep my children in a house that had no water. And to me, the real choice, the healthy choice, was to move in with my future husband for the week before the wedding. And because of that, the church refused to marry us. So we ended up eloping, and I left that place. I was their children's worship leader. I had found a church that would let me teach after I had I changed from Southern Baptist to Christian Missionary Alliance, and they would let me do the children's stuff there. And I called them and I said, if I'm not a good enough person for you to marry, then you shouldn't be having me teach your children. And I just never went back. But that was probably one of those first reality check moments when, wait a second, what I'm being told doesn't match up with what's healthy and what's good. Those doubts. Now, doubt had been a big part of my life all along. And when I was first committing back to Christ and stuff, I was dating different individuals, and I found that my beliefs differed by who I was dating. If I dated a King James only guy, I was King James only. And I did date a guy who was Pentecostal at that time for a short time, and I tried being Pentecostal, but I found it a little odd. I realized that I needed to know more about God's Word, so I went to Word of Life Bible Institute. And one of my first days there, as I was sitting in the seat, I started questioning if any of this was real. That was the first moment that had ever crossed my mind that maybe there was nothing there. And then I went, wait a second, doubt is from the devil. If I'm having doubts about that, that means the devil is sending the doubts. If the devil is sending doubts, then that means God is real. So this is real because I'm doubting. Yeah, so anyway, the whole thing was that, and this is a Charles Spurgeon. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Yes, Spurgeon. Doubt discovers difficulties which it never solves. Believe is the word which speaks life. That was the whole part of that thinking, was that doubt could not be entertained. Doubt was actually proof that you were doing what you were supposed to, and you were supposed to believe. But as I was no longer part of the church, and I had moved down here with my husband, and I wasn't able to find a new church home, I didn't feel comfortable, as I was further and further away, I found that I just had doubt and fear. I started worrying that maybe I had been wrong to get remarried, or maybe I had been wrong to go with the bankruptcy, or, and as life had its normal ups and downs, I was just full of a lot of fear. And it got to a point where I couldn't function. And, whoops, let me go back. Oh, we'll get to that in just a second. I got to a point where I couldn't function. And I started seeing a hypnotist, which was like...
Why not?
Right, at that point, why not? And when I started seeing him, he said, how will you know that you're better? And I said, when I can pray again. Because I had gotten to a point where I couldn't pray. Because I was realizing that I was answering my own prayers, and that I was changing what had happened in order to fit with the story, rather than being truthful. I was beginning to see my own deception. For example, one of the testimonies I used to give about God when I owned the store, we had very little money, and the testimony I would give is that I really wanted a new pair of sandals because my sandals were wearing out. And I prayed about it, and 2 days later in the mail, what was there but a new pair of sandals? God provides. God took care of me. He answered my prayer. That's how I would tell the story. Here's what really happened. Nightly, I prayed for everything we needed. We needed food. We needed finances. We needed money for the heat bill. We needed customers. I needed so many things for the kids and for myself. 3 weeks earlier, my mom had been to visit and had noticed that my sandals were wearing out. And I had said, that's all right, I can trust God for new sandals. She had gone home and a friend had given her a bunch of used shoes. And in there was a pair of sandals. My mom thought, oh, Gwen needs sandals. We wear the same size. Maybe she would like these. And she had mailed them to me. I had been praying about many things, including sandals, for months. I happened to receive sandals from my mom who had known my need. And what really bothers me now is that I realized that who should have been thanked was my mom. That's who really deserved the thanks. She was the one who had seen a need and found a way to meet that particular need. And instead, I used it to praise God.
No return address on the box? Or?
There was.
Okay.
It was from my mom. And I knew it was from my mom.
So
but
the delusion was incredibly intense at that point.
very intense with the delusion. And even when what happened was when the reality started coming into play, I realized that I was being delusional. So it was actually a beautiful moment to realize that I had been answering my own prayers. I had been changing things to make them be an answer. I wasn't really getting answered prayer. I was finding answers. And I started taking some classes online. And this was the mind-blowing, mind-shifting event that really, for me, it almost created a Wizard of Oz experience where you pull back the curtain. This concept of a real imaginary entity. So we'll do this just kind of as a back and forth for just a moment. Up here we've got a lot of companies. You probably recognize some of them: Johnson & Johnson, Ford, Bridgestone, Oracle. These are companies, but they aren't real. There is no such thing as a company. Think about it for a second. Is it the employees that make these companies companies? You could get new employees, right? How about, is it the board of directors? No, you can replace the board of directors. Is it the product these companies sell? No, they can change the products they sell and they could still be a company. Is it the buildings they're in?
No.
No, because they could have new buildings. What is it that makes these companies real?
Articles of incorporation.
Exactly. And how do you get an article of incorporation? You pay the right money and follow the right procedure and file it in front of the right properly dressed officiant, a judge. And now it becomes real because we as a people agree to behave as if it is real. But if we all said, and we dissolved the articles of incorporation, and we said Johnson & Johnson no longer exists, there is nothing that actually disappears. There is no real, tangible item there. And when I grasped that concept, I went, that's the God I've been worshiping. It's always been the agreement I've had with the others in my group that made God real. Because that had been my big struggle, is I was really going, I don't know where to go, but God has always been so real to me. And the point I want to get across with this is that for those believers in your life who especially are very intense, God is real. God is as real to them as these companies are because they have made an agreement with other people that it's real. So they interpret the world in light of it being real. Because we believe Ford is real, we know who to call and what to do when our Ford vehicle has an issue. We know who to sue when there's a problem with some Johnson & Johnson product. But there isn't anything that is really Johnson & Johnson. It's just our agreement. And that, to me, cleared everything up. God was an agreement that I had made with other people. But there wasn't actually anything there. Now, I can't say 100% sure that there isn't some supernatural being somewhere. I can say with 100% confidence that the God I had constructed and believed in does not exist, because it was a construction of my own agreements between myself and the people that I interacted with. And it was a result of the agreement that my parents had made with other people and passed on to me.
Their parents and their parents.
And their parents and their parents. I'm actually, it goes back 10 generations of pastors. My grandfather was a minister, his father was a minister. And I'm really excited, though, because I just found out that one of the churches that a great-great-great-great-grandfather pastored was the Old Ship Church in Massachusetts. And a descendant of his is now pastoring there. And my mom said we should go. And I'm going to go with her because it's a Unitarian Universalist church now. I'm like, I want to go in and say, hi, cousin. So anyway, that was really that was what totally shifted. But it really took getting to a place where I was not engulfed and completely wrapped up in the world that I was in. Being able to recognize that I was creating these things, and then being able to explain those God experiences. I think that's probably, I'm talking with someone online, and that's one of the hardest things for him to grasp, is that he's had what he calls a God experience. And so he doesn't know how to let go of that. And that was the biggest thing that I struggled with, is I had these God experiences. And looking back, I can see it was just that agreement I had with others. So now the exciting part. This is the best part. Oops, it's not clicking. There we go. No one's watching me! I love this! There is no one watching
That's
me!
what you think.
Except the NSA or
Except the NSA, but nobody is inside my head recording every little thought, getting ready to play it at the end times. I've been told as a child that when I died, everything I had thought, everything I had done would be played up on a giant screen for me to be judged. And so I had to watch what I thought. It wasn't even just about what I did publicly, it was what I thought. And I still remember I came in the bedroom and I went, no one's watching me! This is mine! Everything in here is mine and mine alone. And that has been so liberating, because everything was around not just how you behave, but how you think. The other great thing is this nuanced thinking. I went from black and white, it's either good or it's bad, to having fun. Now here I am, I was with some friends, and we saw an Irish tea leaf reader. Now, I would have steered clear of that years ago, because to me it was real. There were real demons who would be enabling that conversation, and I had to not participate. Now, with my open-mindedness and my different thinking, I said, I want to try this out. And I didn't have to worry about whether or not I was sinning or committing some fraud. I didn't believe she was really telling any fortune, but it was fun. She made some nice comments, and we had fun, and she stirred her tea leaf, and she spoke in an Irish accent. And it was just great to be able to experience something for no other reason but the sake of experiencing it. That was awesome. And then finally, one of the big things, though, was the afterlife. And that was a hard thing to give up. I remember when my grandmother had passed away, and I wrote a poem, or found a poem. My memory's fuzzy, I'm not sure if I found it or wrote it, but what I remember about my grandmother was that whenever we would go to visit her, she would always be waiting at the door for us. And I thought she just stood there and waited. I know now that there was a little bridge that made noise when the car went over, and that's how she knew to be at the door. When she passed away, I'm pretty sure I found the poem about waiting at Heaven's Gate. And I read that. Whew, phew, I almost sneezed in front of all of you. And it talked about how, she had always waited for us at the gate, but we knew that she would be waiting for us at Heaven's Gate when we got there. And we'd drawn all this comfort from believing that I would see her again when we got to heaven. And I remember my oldest daughter, who's not here, asking if great-grandma would make her mashed potatoes in heaven. And that's just how real heaven was to us. And really this past year has been coming to terms with the fact that I'm not going to see her again. That there is no afterlife I'm looking for. That this is it. And on one hand, that is so exciting because this is it. This is what we get. And I want to make the most of it. What's brought me comfort, though, is realizing that it's the memories that let us live on. And as I was going through one of my boxes, I came across a pattern to make these little sunbonnet baby dolls. And these are just little Christmas ornaments that my grandmother had made one year in, I think it was 78. And she had decorated the entire tree with that. And I remember going up and asking her if she thought I could ever make anything so beautiful. And she had said, yes, absolutely. And she'd sent me the pattern. I don't remember what I got for Christmas, but I still have that pattern. So this year I've been making these little sunbonnet baby dolls and realizing that my grandmother does live on. She lives on through me, through my memories, and as I pass those memories on. And so I gave my family all a sunbonnet baby for their tree this year. And that's my way of life continuing, because it's not about some magical afterlife. It's about how we touch people today. And it's about the memories we make with other people today. And we don't need to wait. And this was the other part, is I don't need to wait for some afterlife to enjoy my grandmother or to enjoy those memories. I can enjoy them now because she does live on in my memories of her, as I hope to in my grandchildren someday, hopefully a long time in the future. And so again, one of the things that I just really am hoping that you've captured from this is, again, just how tight, how controlling that faith thinking is. It is really a prison of sorts that you don't even realize you're in. It feels clear. It feels concise. There was a time when the marriage was going badly that I envied Mennonites because everything was dictated, not just how I behaved towards my husband. Even what I wore would be dictated, and I longed for something of that. Of what it's like to go through that process of moving into Freethought. It takes a lot of doubt, and it can be very hard to go through that process. And sometimes, if you've got someone in your life who is in that particular stage, they may actually be a little nastier if you talk to them about things than others, because they're so desperate to hold on to what they had. I was so desperate to hang on to what I had had that I created all sorts of magical thinking in order to try and make it real. I remember having debates with non-believers, and I was a young earth creationist as well. I remember having debates about that, and I was just so desperate to hang on to what I knew. But the joy and the beauty is that it is possible, come on clicker, to get to a point of free thought thinking. And I love how emancipated I feel. I feel like my own person again. I feel like I have a say. No longer have I abdicated everything to some heavenly being. And I don't have to really worry about whether or not there's anything supernatural out there. This natural world is enough. This is enough. And you had asked earlier, how do I know? Well, for me, I know because my experiences I can trace back through documents I wrote, through memories, that I was making it seem like God. There wasn't anything external. And all of those God moments can be explained either by some of the, like I had one moment where I saw the room filled with light. I did. I felt the whole room. It was warm. I was on the floor. I'd been praying. Everything filled with light. And it was this God moment. But they can recreate that for astronauts when they're putting them through the training. They can recreate that by jiggling a piece of the libula, don't remember exactly. But it's a physiological response to an intense emotional or physical strain. And I'd been praying for hours on my knees. Well, of course something strange is probably going to happen. So anyway, any additional questions? Yes.
Yeah, Gwen, that was a very interesting talk, and I have a question, but it's not for you, it's for your kids.
Okay.
Was this a revelation to you, or did you already know all this?
I know most of it.
Okay, I mean,
Some of it. Not, I don't know.
What age in your life did the change happen?
Which part of it? I mean, the
Well-
part where you finally...
Were you born into the faith that she had?
Yes.
Oh, so it
very
happened sometime
indoctrines in it.
She actually, at the age of 3, prayed to receive Jesus as her Savior in front of the entire congregation.
Oh, yeah.
And one of my most painful memories was, well, the funny one and then the painful one. She was 6, I think.
Oh, no.
Yes. And she had gone over to her little Jewish friend's house and had witnessed to her Jewish friend.
That's
And
boldness.
that is boldness, yes. And the mother came to drop her off and said, we had a little bit of trouble. And when I asked Susanna about it later, she said, they kept trying to make me talk, but I kept telling them they need Jesus or they're going to hell. And we were so proud of her. We were so proud of her because she was taking it to heart. And a couple of years later, we watched a Billy Graham film. And afterwards, she was crying, and she said, are my friends at school going to hell? And we said, yeah, honey, they are.
Wait, when was that?
That was when we were in Schenectady.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. She cried all night.
This is public school.
She was in a public school. Yeah. We did homeschool for a while. We used private schools for a while. We used public school. It depended on whether or not we felt we were needing to insulate our kids or use them as missionaries in the public school. But Susanna probably left the faith fairly recently. I mean, you stopped going to church in your teens, but I don't think you really...
I stopped going, really, after we left, Watertown. I mean, I went to the CMA church, but I didn't really...
pay attention.
No.
And then James, I think you've told me that you never really believed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he never did have a profession of faith. And when I told him that I was an atheist, he kind of said, he looked at me and says, oh, what did you say again? It was like, glad you finally figured it out or something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah.
I was just counting up all the hours that I've spent in church. That I could have been watching cartoons.
Yeah, she was the one who turned around and was like, now? Like, I'm sorry.
How long before now did you change?
It was a year ago.
Oh, that recently?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, you held on for a long time.
Yes. Yeah, I'm 45 now, and I was 44.
Great for you to bring this all public. It's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's, I feel it's important for many reasons. One, I need to share it. And two, as I've been trying to find other like-minded people in this last year, I've realized that if you don't know what it's like on that inside, you can accidentally be very insensitive to people of faith. And it's not going to be insensitivity that helps bring people out. It's going to be understanding just how imprisoned they are with those thoughts. And I would love to see more people walk away from this heavy type of religion, even if they move to a more liberal type of faith. It was this heavy fundamentalist type of faith that was so damaging. Did you ever follow up?
Oh, I guess you could call them, I mean, you look at Islam today, and I don't know what the percentage is of radical Islamists, but it's kind of like, you know, radical Christianity as well. So.
Absolutely. It was very radical. And I do want to caution that my experience is not what a lot of people experience in church, or actually maybe not a high percentage, but there were a lot of us who still are in this type of a mindset where...
All consuming.
What?
It's totally consuming.
It's all consuming, yes. I mean,